So thank you very much for coming to our session today. Our topic will be Board of Directors Best Practices. My name is Hadelind. I'm from the Kingdom of Northreach. I have a fair amount of experience on nonprofit boards within the state of Alaska and a little bit within the state of Michigan. So if you're not from Alaska or Michigan, I do not have any experience with the laws and statutes that govern how your board of directors needs to be run, and what I will provide to you today is resources on how to find that out for yourself. I should also probably preface this. This is not my profession. I'm not I'm a legal authority in any of these matters. If you ever have any questions about how your board of directors needs to be structured in order to comply with your state law, please consult a lawyer. That is not me. But other than that, I can totally go over best practices and sort of ways to figure out how to navigate being on a board and running your board. So the first question I want to cover, which you may or may not be familiar with, I've discovered that there is a varying level of understanding of the role of board of directors when it comes to Amtgarders. So the first question is, what is board of directors anyway? The first thing to understand is that it is mandated by law that a nonprofit organization be run by a board of directors. Of course, we're all required to be nonprofit organizations, so we all have one. Your board of directors is going to be made up of officers and sometimes additional directors who are not directly officers. They are responsible for governing your nonprofit in the legal sense of the word. You may have another group that makes pertinent decisions for your group, but the board of directors, when it comes down to it, is who is legally liable for those decisions that are made for your organization. In most states, it's required that your board of directors consist at a minimum of a president, a vice president, a secretary, and a treasurer. In some states, it's just a president and a vice president. In some states, you can have multiple vice presidents. In some states, you don't have to have a treasurer. In some states, those offices can be held by, multiple offices can be held by one person. But typically, you need those 4 offices on your board of directors. So once you have a board, the next question is, what does your board do? Essentially, as I said before, the board is the body of legal liability for your organization. The requirements for your board's duties will vary a little bit state to state. You'll notice a trend. There's a lot of variation on what your board may have to do. But typically, they're required to meet on a regular basis, and that will be governed by 2 separate things: your state's requirements, your state statutes, and then your organization's bylaws. Again, the board's responsible for all of the activities from a legal standpoint. They can delegate that authority to other groups or committees or individuals, but ultimately, when the shit hits the fan, it's their responsibility. So, again, ultimately responsible for the organization. Why do we need a board? I hear that question actually fairly commonly in Amtgard because we're used to our top 5 being sort of the body of authority. The really simple answer is it's required by law, so you gotta have one. A better answer, right, is not just because it's the law, but boards do a lot of things to improve the way an organization is run. They promote accountability, they expand networks, and boards have special fiduciary and legal responsibilities for the organization, which technically your top 5 doesn't have, aside from our culture has instilled it. But from a legal standpoint, your GMR or your champion is not going to probably, depending on your organizational structure, go to court if some legal issue arises. How is a board formed? Really, it depends on what the laws of the state are. in which your organization is incorporated. Typically, though, your bylaws are going to describe this. There may be some specific laws in your state that require your bylaws to cover how your elections are held, or who can hold your elections, or how often your elections can be held. But typically, boards are elected from amongst your membership. What your membership is defined as is also another topic that is defined by state statute and your organization's bylaws. So, what are bylaws? So essentially, these are the rules that your organization says they're going to follow. They have to be registered and recorded with the state in which your organization is incorporated. So for Alaska, that's really easy. We have one kingdom and we have parks in one state. So all of our activities are governed by one set of state statutes, and I never have to wonder if I'm using the right set of laws. Very few other kingdoms have that luxury. And so it's important to know where your organization is incorporated, because those are the state laws that govern the organization. They are full legal documents, so it's not like I just whipped up these rules on a napkin and gave them to somebody and this is just a suggestion or a good idea. Your board of directors is legally bound to follow those rules. There is the potential for legal liability if they choose not to follow those rules. It's really important for directors to understand that when you sign up for that, you are held to uphold those bylaws. It's not optional. So this question comes up quite frequently. Can we change our bylaws? I don't like them. That seems silly. That doesn't apply to us anymore. That's not how we work. And that will be defined by your bylaws, whether or not or how you can change them. I don't know for certain, but I know for other states. I know in the state of Alaska, it's required that your bylaws include a clause on how to amend your bylaws. So that's, you can't file your bylaws and record them with the state of Alaska unless it includes the option for them to be amended. Typically, it's pretty standard for bylaws to be amended via a vote of your membership. It may be different with the requirements of the threshold. Sometimes it's a 2/3 vote, sometimes it's a simple majority, sometimes it requires that your board approves them and then your membership approves them. The moral of this story is bylaws will tell you how to change your bylaws. So after all of that, or maybe even before all of that, you're interested in being on a board. First off, that's awesome. Our organization doesn't run unless we have people who are willing to volunteer to be a part of the board, a board. There are several boards of which you could be a member. Very first thing, if you're considering that, you may have gotten a little bit of an inkling that the bylaws of the organization that you're considering running for the board for are very important. So you should read those before you run for the board. That often doesn't happen. It's really crucial because once you're elected, you're held to those. So first and foremost, before you put your name up, read the bylaws, understand what you're signing up for. Keep a copy handy. If you are responsible for an organization, you should always have the resources available. So I have my organization's bylaws on my phone. I'm not currently on the Northreach board. I'm on the board of a couple other nonprofit organizations within Alaska that are not Amtgard related. But questions come up, and as a member of that board, what you say can often be construed as gospel. And so it's always a good idea to take a pause. Let me consult my bylaws before I give you an answer on that. Take out your phone, look it up, If it's not incredibly clear, consult with the rest of your board. I'll get back with you on that after I consult with the board for an answer. Learning about your bylaws and knowing your bylaws isn't enough. You need to understand your state laws and state statutes. So I also have the Alaska state statutes that govern nonprofit organizations bookmarked on my phone, on my computer, and I hand that out like candy. There are questions that come up usually in regards to changing the bylaws, where a member will say, well, that seems stupid, it seems inefficient for us to do it that way. Why? We should change that. And then we go through the process of, you're right, it is maybe inefficient. However, the Alaska state statutes require that we do it that way. So we can't put our bylaws in opposition of the state law. If we choose to, the state law trumps our bylaws. Like in the hierarchy, the state law wins. So if you have a conflict between what your bylaws say and what your state's law says, you got to go with what the state law says. And then you should probably go through that process of amending your bylaws to align them. The other thing, if you're interested in being on the board, so be aware that you should be at least familiar with your state laws, right? You don't have to be a lawyer or have a law degree in order to be an effective and productive board member. But also start looking for resources. What resources are available for you as a board member or as an officer to do your job better? There is the National Council for Nonprofits, and each state has a group that is a member of that National Council that makes themselves available specifically to support nonprofits that are incorporated in their state, with resources for how do I figure out what my laws are, how do I figure out how to counsel other board members who may not be educated in these areas, is there training available and whatnot. So again, before you join the board, be aware of what those resources are so that as you're starting your journey as a volunteer, you have some goodies in your pocket to be able to pull out when hard situations arise. So again, do I need to be a lawyer? You don't need to be a lawyer. It probably doesn't hurt. And Google is your friend. There are so many resources that are available for free on the internet if you understand how to Google things. I have a link here that is really handy for understanding the very basic requirements for nonprofits in the 50 states. It's harvardcompliance.com/information/nonprofit-governance-by-state. I'll also make this slide available, and maybe in our post-editing process, we'll make the link available here. Maybe not, sorry. But there are a lot of really good resources available if you just Google them. If you have a question about how your nonprofit should be run, what are some recommendations, lots and lots of nonprofit law firms have great blogs where they drop nuggets of information for free as long as you are willing to go through and read it. Another good thing, if you're struggling on how do I start learning about nonprofit law statutes or statutes in my state, is just Google your state nonprofit law or statutes. That's really a helpful phrase. All right, so there's a whole bunch of, I'm going to talk about duties here for a lot of time. Before I jump into that, I wanted to touch on fiscal responsibility. So first off, this is not just your prime minister's job. Remember, if we go back to the board of directors is sort of where the legal buck stops. If there is fiscal mismanagement, ultimately that is the responsibility of the board. So be aware of that as a member of the board, you are taking on that legal responsibility. Recommendation, your board should be setting an annual budget because they're the body that is ultimately liable for how that money is handled. That doesn't mean that your board has to sit down and hash it all out. They can absolutely delegate that to your Kingdom Prime Minister, and local Prime Ministers could be working together. They could delegate that to the Kingdom Monarch, who hopefully is also a member of your board, but may not be, depending upon the way that your kingdom is structured. So again, it doesn't have to be that your board controls all of that tightly without the influence or advice of other top 5 kingdom and local level. But since they're ultimately responsible for it, they should be reviewing it if they're not preparing it. Again, if funds are mismanaged, legally that's the board that's responsible for that. It's also sort of the board's job to plan for success. If you look at the way that boards work outside of Amtgard, the board is usually who's setting the direction for an organization. So they're doing strategic planning, and they're looking at how can I ensure that this organization is better than it is today in 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years. They're your visionaries, and they may not be the implementers, and that may be your more boots on the ground people, but traditionally a board of directors is who's setting your strategy. In Amtgard, it sometimes isn't that way, and there is probably a really good debate to be had on whether or not it should be, and I'll leave that to other people to debate and just give that information that, we do things a little bit differently sometimes. But at a minimum, your board should be planning for fiscal success and responsibility. Hopefully your board terms are alternating with your officer terms, with your top 5 officer terms. They may not be, again, depending upon your kingdom structure. Sometimes that gives you, in theory, it should be giving you more continuity without having a complete and total turnover every 6 months or a year. Again, it really depends on how your kingdom is set up. And I just clicked off of this one, which is bad on me, but the very last bullet point I had was just because your organization is a nonprofit doesn't mean you can't have income. That has nothing to do with board best practices. It's just a little point that I like to include, because sometimes it gets confusing to people who think, well, we're a nonprofit, so we're not allowed to have income. You absolutely can have income. What you're not allowed, and you are allowed to have profit, right? It's just that the profit that you make needs to be put back into the IRS has a term for it, the mission activities, the program activities of the organization. So if you run an event and you make $50,000, that's awesome. Now take that $50,000 and make Amtgard better, and you're good. What you can't do is take that $50,000 and just stick it in your pocket. That's not a nonprofit. And again, not necessarily related to board best practices, but something to keep in mind as you're working through your fiscal responsibility as a board. Don't be afraid to make money. Making money is a good thing. Just put it back into Amtgard, and you're good. Fiduciary duties. I love the word fiduciary. It's a great word. There are 3 main fiduciary duties that your board is responsible for, of, from, with. Pick another preposition, tag it on the end of that in a grammatically incorrect sentence. First one is the duty of care. Second one is the duty of loyalty. And the third one is the duty of obedience. These are really, when it gets down to it, like board best practices, right? This isn't going to be governed typically by your state statutes. Your bylaws probably don't outline what the duty of care is from your board members, but as a board member, you are responsible. So the duty of care is basically that as a board member, you will exercise good business judgment and use ordinary care and prudence in the operation of the organization, which says that I will take care of this organization, that I will not say, it's not my business, so I don't care. We can do whatever we want. let's take that $50,000 that we made from an event, and yeah, I think it's totally fine that we will just buy everybody a Razor scooter. Right? That's not good for your organization. So that would be violating the duty of care. Board members are expected or perhaps must participate actively in governance and oversight of the organization's activities. So bump on a log directors are violating their duty of care. If you're on the board, you are expected to be an active participant in the governance of your organization. You have a job. You were elected to do it. And the duty of care says, yeah, you got to. Directors also must act in good faith, again with ordinary care, and in a manner that they find that they reasonably believe to be in the best interest of the organization. So again, we all make mistakes, right? We're not perfect individuals. Some of us have never been on board before. This is like a whole new spiel. We're not really sure. As long as you are doing what you believed to be the right thing for the organization, you are not violating the duty of care. So this allows for people to be human, which is great because we all are. The issue comes in when a director isn't operating in good faith, right? They have an ulterior motive. They have their own personal agenda. They're not looking out for the best interests of the organization. They're looking out for the best interests of their friend, their personal business, themselves. At that point in time, they are violating several of the duties, but one of them being duty of care. Next one is the duty of loyalty. This one has 3 key components. So the director may not usurp corporate opportunities for personal gain. Right? So essentially what we're saying here in the duty of loyalty is that when I'm working on board business, I'm working for the board and the organization. And you're at that event that we're going to make $50,000 on, but you recognize through information that you obtained by being a member of the board that if you change things just a little bit, your buddy could make $40,000 and the organization could make 10. And that would be absolutely violating the duty of loyalty, right? You're not putting the organization above personal gain, whether it's for you or for someone else. You must avoid engaging in interested transactions without board approval. So say that in that situation where we made that $50,000, you do see an opportunity for someone to improve the event, and they may stand to make some financial gain from it, but it's not detracting from the organization's benefit, right? It may be building on that, maybe improving the event. Before just, saying, yeah, it's fine, we can do that. And that should go through your board, for your board to decide whether or not that's a benefit that they want to bring to the event, knowing that there will be some personal gain for another person. If there's no personal gain to be had, you can discuss that as a board, how you'd like to handle it. But when there's any personal gain involved, whether it's for you or a person that you know, that needs to go through board approval, just to make sure everything's above board and nothing is looking like it's under the table. And the duty of loyalty also requires that directors must maintain the organization's confidential information. That one can be hard sometimes because as a member of a board, you may be privy to some really some information that should be very closely guarded. Okay. And it shouldn't have to be expressly stated when you're having a board meeting, but sometimes it helps to remind people. Any information that is given to the board in a confidential manner must remain confidential. And that means you don't tell anybody who's not on that board. And when you're not on the board anymore, you still don't tell anybody. Because that's information that you gained because people trusted you, they elected you to this position, and it's your job to maintain that confidentiality, whether you're on the board or not anymore. You obtain the information while you're on the board, you are now still bound by that duty of loyalty to not divulge that information. This is, also part of goes across sort of all of the duties, is that you have to act in the best interest of the organization at all times. That's your job as a board member, is to look out for the organization. You put the organization's interests above your own in your capacity as board member. Duty of obedience. Yeah, I hate this word. I like fiduciary way better. However, it's an important word in the context of being a board member. We have to work to ensure that the organization complies with all of the state statutes and regulations, that we act in accordance with our own policies, and that we carry out our mission appropriately. So it says the duty of obedience is sort of the more succinct way to talk about all of the slides previously, where I said, hey, you have to follow those bylaws, you have to follow your state statutes and regulations, and it's your job as a board member to make sure that that happens. So if your board decides to go rogue and violate your bylaws, each of those directors would have violated their duty of obedience. Handling disputes. Boards never have to do this. You just sit there, you go to meetings, and you talk about some stuff, and then at the end you're like, yay, that was fun, look, I helped. No, in actuality, they always have to do this. It's super, super common. So when a dispute comes to your board for resolution, the very first thing you want to do, what do your bylaws say? Hopefully, your bylaws have been written in such a way as to clearly define the appropriate manner to handle disputes that come to your board. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's a little bit fuzzy, or it's a little bit murky, it's unclear, and then you have to say, great, what's my next resource? At that point in time, you look at your state statutes. Okay, my state statutes are probably more exhaustive than your bylaws. There'll be pages and pages and pages and pages and pages and pages and pages. Hopefully your bylaws are not that long. And they may or may not be, it may be very difficult to parse through your state statutes and figure out what is my board required, or how is my board required to handle this situation, and how do we resolve this dispute in a manner that upholds our laws. That's not unusual. State statutes are not easy reading. They are not really typically written for the average person to just pick up and thumb through and figure out what's going on. And if you're not a lawyer, you may have never looked through state statutes before. So this is where we go back to, when you're thinking about being on the board, you started looking for resources. This councilofnonprofits.org has some great resources on a state-by-state basis of other nonprofit organizations who exist solely to support other nonprofit organizations. So these guys make it their business to help nonprofits. As a nonprofit, they're living it every single day. So they're usually incredibly expert resources, and they are usually also willing to provide a certain level of advice, or I'm going to hesitate to say counsel, advice for free. So you can usually reach out to them, you can call them, you can email them, sometimes they'll have a web form, and ask your very specific question. Sometimes the organizations will have bylaw review services that they offer. Some of them are free, where you can just send them your bylaws and say, hey, do you see any holes here? They'll usually see some. Sometimes they charge for that service. It's usually very minimal, as opposed to if you were considering having a lawyer take a look at those same bylaws. It might be $150 for them to review your bylaws. Typically, that review is done by a lawyer that's working with or for that nonprofit support organization. So it is qualified counsel within the state of which you are incorporated. So that's sort of my third tier of, I have this dispute, my bylaws don't clearly define it, my state statute is confusing or doesn't clearly define it, or in even worse scenarios, gives contradictory advice, because that absolutely happens in state statute. Go to your nonprofit resource and say, I am at a loss here, can you give me some direction? And again, a lot of that will be available for free for a certain level. Strategic planning. So I touched on this a little bit earlier, and the long and the short of it is the organization won't lead itself. Right? Like my boss at work loves to talk about self-organizing teams. It's his new favorite thing, where basically if you just leave a team alone, they'll figure it out. That doesn't work, especially for large organizations. They'll figure it out. Yeah, they'll definitely do that. It probably will not comply with your bylaws or the state statutes or drive your organization in a positive, successful direction for the future. So I recommend not doing that, and instead utilizing your board for that strategic planning process. If your board has never done strategic planning before, that nonprofit support organization in your state is happy to provide training and information on how to go about doing that. Being a good board member is a learned skill. Nobody comes to the board knowing exactly how to be awesome at that job. And it doesn't matter if you've been monarch of your park for the last 25 years. That does not mean that you walk onto a board and understand how to be a really good board member. Because those are different skill sets. You may have a huge leg up, right? Because you're obviously comfortable in a leadership position. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you got this. Spend some time developing the skill set that is required to be a good board member, which is all the things we talked about earlier. So the other thing when you're looking at strategic planning, one, we need to do it as a board. And look at what's your membership looking for. And this speaks a little bit to what's the role of the board. The board should be governing and shepherding the organization at the direction of the membership. The organization ultimately belongs to your membership. The board's just making sure that the things that people want to have happen are going to happen, that they become reality, that the organization is successful at achieving those goals. Your membership may not know what they want. So that may have to be where your board starts the conversation. Like, hey, what do you guys want to do? What do we want to be when we grow up? What do we want to be in our second life? What do we want? And that can be sometimes a very interesting process, because everybody wants a little bit different. They have a different vision. And so then the board has to come back and sort of distill that down to this is achievable. This is reasonable. This is in compliance with our bylaws and state statutes. These are things that we are allowed to do. And then you can set about making the plan of how to get there. Another point to consider is don't be afraid to make long-term plans. While you may not be on the board long-term, the board as a body will be there long-term. So if nobody makes plans further than 6 months out, it's awfully hard to grow your organization and to ensure that you will be more successful in 10 years than you are today. And that can be really hard to do because, again, you may only be on the board for 6 months or a year. So part of that comes down to document your strategic planning. As a board, keep track of what discussions you had, what decisions you came to, why you came to those decisions, and don't be afraid to plan out some milestones that may be a year, 2 years in the future. That doesn't mean that the next board that comes in doesn't look at that and make adjustments. And that's okay. It's part of planning is to be flexible to the changing needs of the organization and the membership. But if we never sit down and make those long-term plans, you will forever be just in that startup phase and never getting to the point where you have a very mature board with mature processes that drive your organization to success. Being a good director. So this is the responsibility of each individual, and not as opposed to the board as a whole, as a body. So each individual director needs to be engaged. Sometimes that can be hard if you've been on the board for a long time. You get a little bit comfortable with what's going on, and yeah, this is cool, everything's great, and I've been doing this for a long time. So take a step back. Find a way to reinvigorate your engagement. What excited you about being part of a board in the first place? Maybe you just sort of got there and you weren't really sure what this was all about, and so you're not sure how to be engaged because you're not sure what your job is. So at that point in time, seek out your resources, know your bylaws, look at your state statutes, right? Understand what your role is so that you can be productively engaged. It is part of your job as a director to be active. If you see other directors not being active, engage them, right? Sometimes, boards are made up of a lot of different personalities. Some people are very quiet and they're not going to advertise their opinion. They're not going to, just step up in the conversation and state their stance. So typically, the president of the board should be encouraging each person to communicate in your board meetings. Sometimes it doesn't happen, it gets overlooked. As an individual member of the board, I think it's absolutely okay for, within the structure of how your meetings are run, to, call out on people who are being less engaged and encourage them to actively participate in the conversations that are being had.
When you say less engaged, are you talking about within the board itself or within, our boards are responsible to and for our members?
Right.
Are you talking about them playing Amtgard?
Could be. Yeah.
Okay, so.
Yeah, and really that depends on, if you get down here, here's this, know the values of your organization. Does your membership expect your board members to be active Amtgarders? Maybe they don't. Those are values of your organization. And there are board structures outside of Amtgard where the board may not be made up of people who are actively involved in the organization. They may come from other arenas with other skill sets that they bring to the board to expand the expertise of the board. In that situation, those directors are expected to be actively engaged in the board, but they may not be expected to be actively engaged in the daily running of the organization. For most Amtgard, we do expect them to be Amtgarders. But again, that's, what does your organization value?
In that type of structure, it would probably be really beneficial to have a committee that is made up of people that are close to the game portion to communicate.
Absolutely. And I don't know that there are any kingdoms that are structured that way on purpose. There may be kingdoms that get structured that way just sort of through organic development. People who are still interested in leadership but for whatever reason can't go to the park or don't go to the park or whatever. And that boils down to what is the organization value? What does the organization expect and want from their directors? There's not necessarily a right way to board, right? It's based on the values and desires of the organization and meeting the bylaws and the state statutes. From there, you can, in theory, take it in whichever direction your organization supports. But, anytime you're moving away from organizational values as a board, you need to go back and look at those list of fiduciary duties. You may be violating them. So, Again, being a good director. Seeking out resources, be communicative. It's really hard to lead an organization that you don't ever talk to. Right? It's hard to stay connected and to understand what the current values of your organization are if you don't talk to them. And that's bi-directional, right? Like as a director, I should be seeking contact with my membership. I should be working with top 5. I should be working with newbies. Anybody who's involved in the organization, I should be available to talk to them, and they should feel, available to talk to me. The board as a whole should be communicating, through official channels with the membership on a pretty regular basis. That makes it a lot easier to be transparent. Membership that's informed is typically much happier with the board activities. A lot of times, directors and boards don't mean to have a lack of transparency or lack of communication, but the board gets bogged down with work, and then also trying to still be involved in Amtgard, and have a life outside of Amtgard too. It happens. So remind yourself as a director to be transparent and be communicative and go that extra mile to take that moment out of your Sunday afternoon or your Monday morning or wherever you have that time to just, touch base with your board. Hey, I know we made some decisions. Who knows about that? Have we told people what decision was made, how it was made, why it was made? And it doesn't matter if it's a controversial decision or not. Like any decision that your board makes, it should be easy for membership to know about that. And there's a whole lot of strategies that your board can look at on how to be transparent, how to be communicative, what works best for your organization. Do people want to know about stuff face-to-face? Do they want to know about it via Facebook? Probably. Do you have some type of official repository for all board decisions? You should. Most states require that your board minutes be publicly available. I don't know about all states. I know the state of Alaska does. And again, not being a lawyer, I don't know the rules in other states, but I know how to find those rules, and that is to use Google. Not gonna lie. And at the end of the day, the way to be a really good director is don't forget that you work for the members. You're running the organization, you're leading the organization, you have all these responsibilities on behalf of the members. It's not your organization. The board doesn't own your organization. The board governs the organization on behalf of the members. And if you, as a board and as a specific individual, keep that first and foremost in your brain and your gray matter, you will be operating in good faith right off the bat. Right? If that's what you're remembering first and foremost, you are going to be much less likely to be violating any of those fiduciary duties. You're going to be on track. Doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, but it will help when those situations arise of, I'm not really sure what I should be doing here. Look at, okay, well, if I look at this problem from the lens of I'm working on behalf of my membership, does that clarify any of my situations here? And usually it will, if you've got an array of choices, it'll pretty quickly kill a couple of the outliers. Well, clearly I can't do that because that's not in the best interest of my membership or organization. So you keep that first and foremost in your brain as you're going through board duties. I already talked about a lot of these. I forgot I had this slide. I kind of meshed them together. So being a good board is a little bit different than just being a good board member. The board has to be able to work together. You can have 5 of the most amazing individual board members, but if they can't work together, you ain't gonna get nothing done. And you will spend a lot of time talking, making no decisions, and getting nothing actually in place to be productive. So you're a leadership team. You're not a leadership one. It's a team of you that's doing this. You have to be able to work that together. Part of that requires that you are able to set your ego aside. The board isn't about you. The board is about the organization, and the board is about serving the membership. This one is kind of, dang it. I can't highlight things. Actively seek out fresh board members. Sometimes that's really hard because bringing new people on the board means training them. They don't know how to spell fiduciary. Right? They don't know. It is. They don't know that there are state laws that govern what Amtgard does. Right? There's a whole bunch of education that goes along with that. But that education brings some opportunities. As veteran board members, there's no better way to verify that you know what you're talking about than to try to teach somebody else and make sure they understand.
That's a hard thing.
Yeah. So gives you an opportunity to check yourself. Am I up to speed on all of these things that I've been doing for the last 5 years? Have I gotten a little bit rusty? Fresh board members bring fresh perspective, fresh skill set. They may know all sorts of awesome resources because they used to be on a volleyball team that was a nonprofit organization, and they know all sorts of cool tricks within your state to give you some extra leg up. And you're not going to get that unless you bring those new people in. They also make it a little bit easier to stay engaged, right? Fresh energy livens everything up. You'll have discussions that you haven't had in a few years. And if you're open to those discussions because you've set your ego aside, you can often come up with new ways to approach old problems, which can then help open up new strategic plans that can give you that better chance of that long-term success. Part of that sort of goes along with actively seeking out fresh members is making sure that you're documenting your work. Because as you get new people in, they need to be able to look back and see, how have we done this before? What's the history here that I'm involved in? It also is great if you're documenting that, make it available to your members. That goes to that be transparent, be communicative. So as a board, if you make that an important priority to document your work, that will help when you're bringing on new people, and it will help with your transparency. Solicit the input of your members. We talked about that a little bit, right? That can be hard, but really beneficial and incredibly critical to making sure that you're in touch with the values of your organization and that you're actually driving in the direction that your membership supports and wants. Of course, work with your top 5 members. This may be your board, depending upon your structure. It may be a totally separate group of people, depending upon your structure. You should be working collaboratively, though. Bad things happen when your leadership is at odds. So find ways to get on the same page. Make your bylaws easily accessible. Your members should know what rules you're governed by. That's a good thing. Clever members can find that because remember your bylaws had to be recorded with your state. In most states, but not all, those bylaws are also available publicly and electronically. There are some states that just don't have that infrastructure yet. And so that's only available if you go to an office and they dig through some paper. It's only a couple that I found that are still like that. And just a good idea, not necessarily a requirement to be a good board, but stream your board meetings, right? People don't have to be able to ask questions in your board meeting, but they should be able to know what's going on. If you don't want to stream them, you can record them. At the very least, you are required to make your meeting minutes public. So somehow your membership has to know what your board is doing. And if you want to be a really great board, make it real-time available to them. So your membership can be as engaged as they want to be. Here's some sources which really aren't very helpful to you right now because we don't have internet and you can't click on these links. However, this slide will be available somewhere, somehow, right, Goldcrest?
Right.
Awesome. Where you will be able to click on these links. that I use by Googling some of this information. This is a very short list of the various sites that I use on a fairly regular basis. Again, if you're not sure, go to Google. If you're not sure, go to that Council for Nonprofits, which will direct you to a nonprofit support organization in the state in which your organization is incorporated. Talk to those people. They are a wealth of knowledge. It's what they do. And often they have trainings on how to be a good board member, all these things, but like for hours and hours and way more in depth. Really, at the end of the day, best practices, know your bylaws, be familiar with your state statutes, know your resources, be true to your membership.